going on, trading card game players? Figs here with Figs Forum, bringing you guys a discussion video. So I wanted to go ahead and discuss with you guys Knight Horus Adventure. I know Knights have been around for a very long time. With the support that we received most recently with the Horus engine, I definitely think it complements the deck very well based on the type of resources that we have access to. And people have been pretty successful with it, especially at a regional level. The deck has topped, it's won regionals, it's been topping OTS events. It hasn't been too successful in the YCS level, but I definitely think it has a potential when obviously piloted very well and correctly. But I wanted to go ahead and actually give you guys basically a do's and don'ts video of things that we should definitely be considering when pretty much building the deck, playing the deck, different things that we're actually basically utilizing with the deck, and just pretty much my take on what I believe is actually the best options and what I think based on testing and trying the different variants and obviously going over the different strategies that we have access to. I definitely think that there are a lot of misconceptions that I think that some people are overlooking and things that people are experiencing when playing the deck. So I wanted to go ahead and give you guys my take on it because I do believe that it is a deck that, again, when piloted correctly and when built correctly, it can quite probably heavily reward you just for being able to play it right. So let's go ahead and go over it. I'm not going to go in any specific order, just kind of go through based on what we have listed here with the Phantom Knight stuff. Then we'll get into the Horus stuff. Then we'll get into the adventure stuff and some of the other, again, do's and don'ts. So let's go ahead and start off with the Phantom Knight stuff. So Phantom Knight stuff obviously is very generic. We always had the same 10 to 9 card lineup: 3 Torrent Scale, 3 Boots, 2 Cloak, 1 Ragged Gloves, and 1 Stained Greaves. So for a while, I actually was not playing Stained Greaves. I was actually doing 3 Cloak and 2 Torrent Scale. So I do want to start with that. 2 Torrent Scale, 2 Cloak is not the way. You definitely don't want to be playing 2 and 2. You have to remember, the least amount of names that you are playing with this deck, the harder it is to actually play. So even though the Horus engine does give you access to, being able to mill your deck and sending cards to the graveyard, you do want to have access to Phantom Knight names, but you also want to have access to them because they are level 3s. So, the idea obviously of the deck is the same as it always is. You're going Cherubini into Bardiche to obviously get full value. And then obviously, with that being said, you're pretty much using whatever resources you have to establish a board, for your opponent to play into. So 2 and 2, it's not the way. Unfortunately, these names are very important, especially these two. This is obviously an extender, and it's actually less important than Cloak and Torrent Scale because having a direct access to Torrent Scale means that any other name that you draw aside from Stained Greaves, unless you have a name in hand, makes him live, which means that you get a free body, which means by pitching a card allows you to get another free body by being able to send a trap. So again, it is very important that you are maximizing either 3 on the Torrent Scale or 3 on the Cloak. I would never play 2 and 2 because, again, you're taking away some of your most important names and you really want to see them in your opening. Not seeing these cards can be actually really, really, difficult for you, especially when you're playing into a board or trying to set up a board. I mean, I don't know, again, if you're experienced with the deck and you've played it, enough and you've got time, under your belt on the deck, you'll come to realize you need to see at least one realistic name. And when I say realistic name, a name that pretty much can, do something on its own or be a name that can trigger once you find another name. The issue with Stained Greaves that I've always had is that, of course, he only works if you have a name in hand. And getting him to grave is, obviously not the most ideal because even by himself, he just doesn't do enough or do anything. But he is an amazing extender. I have actually, for a while, I wasn't playing him, but I have fit him into my current build. This is not my current build, by the way. This is just, kind of cards compiled. He's definitely made it back into the main board because I found myself a lot of times just, having Cloak and going Cloak Boots, wanting the extender, or going Torrent Scale Boots, wanting the additional extender, which means that we pitch less cards. Because generally, if you're not playing Stained Greaves, you're always looking to go Torrent Scale Boots, Torn, pitch a trap by searching it off the boots, and then pitching a different name, revive, and go from there. So, ideally, you're stopping yourself from having to use an additional trap, getting rid of an additional effect for a name, and then you're also giving yourself the ability to end on an additional interruption, though, a Fog Blade, or whatever else you're able to make with the additional, bodies that you do have. So I think it's important. Again, no 2. No 2, you're either doing 3 and 2 or 3 and 2. Boots obviously at 3 is fine. I do like Ragged Gloves, at a higher number because he's treated as pretty much any other name, because he can send anything. But I think one is fine. You know, you don't want to play too many of him just because of the fact that, you know, this turning into this means that this is like having 4 copies. So if you have 3 of these and 1 of this, it's like, you know, it can be a little convoluted, especially once you've gone through all of your names. But sometimes he is very important, obviously, for your end board, because a lot of times you want to be able to dump a trap to revive the break sword. So, you know, you don't want to have to rely on using him to actually set up your board. You kind of want it just to send it off Bardiche so that you're able to get free access to a trap, you know, to revive your break sword. And then again, Stain Greaves we threw in there. Another do is that we want to make sure that we're actually playing 4 copies of a Phantom Knight card. So I've noticed as of more recently, having access to only 3 has actually made it quite difficult, especially when you're setting up your board. You actually find yourself sometimes going through all 3, especially if you don't have access to Cloak or Stain Greaves. I mean, generally that's obviously, you know, not going to happen as often as you think it would. You know, having access to 4 basically means that on the follow-up, you are able to activate Bardiche effect, because again, a lot of times you're going through almost all of these. You know, Boots searches 1, Bardiche sets 1, Gloves will obviously send 1 as well. So you're usually going through all 3 in the first turn. So having access to an additional one I found to be very useful. I am particularly, you know, fond of obviously playing like the rank up spell. I do like this one a lot. So if you don't want to play 3 Fogblade, you can play this rank up spell for Ophion. Obviously, it's a great addition to the deck because, you know, a lot of this format does rely on 5 or higher. It hurts you a little bit, but of course, if you're floodgating your opponent, you're probably just going to win anyways. But yes, 4 traps or 4 Phantom Knight spell and or trap names, you know, to allow ourselves to have, you know, more access to, or longer access in a longer grind game with Bardiche. Now, getting into the Horus stuff, I definitely do think that the Horus cards are great. I definitely don't think we need 4 names. I notice that's a very common thing that people are doing, and for some reason, it's just not worth it. Like, I can't understand why you'd want to have access to 4 names. Yeah, it'd be cool to be able to summon Photon Lord and Zombie Vampire, but unless you're opening up a name with Mseti, you're going to be pitching a whole lot of cards. And I know that a lot of these cards can float, but you also don't want to, you know, put yourself in too much of a pickle where, you know, you're summoning Photon Lord, you're going for Vampire, and then, you know, you get impermed, nibbed, and then you have absolutely nothing. Like, there are nuances where sometimes, you know, having access to these cards and having to pitch your entire hand just isn't the play. Like, I know that a lot of these cards do recur themselves and replace themselves, but unfortunately, pitching that many cards and having to send 4 different names, especially, again, if you don't hard open them to send them off of King Sark, can feel pretty bad. So definitely not playing 4 names. I think these 3 are the best ones. I mean, I love Happy. I think it's probably actually one of my favorite ones next to Mseti. But yeah, these are the right ones because we're always just basically using these 2 to go into Photon Lord and into Zombie Vampire. And then the Mseti is dark, so he's our extender for Cherubini into Bardiche. So this is definitely the right call. Definitely play 3. Do not play 4. 4 is way too many. Then same thing with King Sark. Do not play 2. Definitely please play 3. There's no reason to not want to be able to see this card. Mseti as well as King Sark are very great cards to open. Yes, this does play into Droll, but again, having access to a card that does allow you to basically play the game is very important for any deck. So being able to have access to King Sark just means that you're able to pretty much, you know, go into Zombie Vampire and attempt to start playing. And you have cards, again, that are being able to be utilized by being pitched, whether it's the Water Enchantress or the PK Engine. So take advantage of it. You know, there's no reason why, you know, we should be limiting ourselves on only playing 2, because 3 is, you know, a great number, especially for this deck. So yeah, as far as the, you know, Horus engine goes, 3, 1, 1. Do not play the 4th. Definitely play all 3 of the King Sark. Do not play 2. As far as spells, you know, definitely Foolish and Rhoda are the best ones. The reason why I have these in here is because when it comes to side decking, these are actually the first cards that I normally consider taking out when I'm going second, because we are drawing a 6th card going second. Your consistency is a little higher and being able to open up, obviously, like your names, your engines. These cards I normally take out going second, but I always put them back in going first because, again, they're consistency cards. So you want to make sure that you are seeing a Phantom Knight name. You want to make sure that you are seeing access to, you know, any of these graveyard cards, whether it's the Adventure line or the Phantom Knight stuff. And of course, this can also send these names as well if need be. So again, these are really great for going first. Going second, these are normally the first cards that I do focus on when I'm looking to take something out, along with call by and, you know, whatever floodgate you prefer, whether it's a D-Berry or whatever. But yeah, so that's you know, just something that I wanted to take note on. So for the adventure package, 3 Water Enchantress is a staple. I would not play anything less than 3 Water Enchantress. It's a level 3 extender. And as a level 3 extender, it obviously gives us valuable resources for what our deck is, capable of being able to take advantage of. The one Wandering Griffin Rider, do not play Illegal Knight. I understand that the card is pretty decent in certain situations, but unfortunately, it is not a great card to open. It's actually a pretty awful card. I would much rather open any of these other names, obviously not these, but any of these other names in my deck other than Illegal Knight. I mean, I understand he's a dark and lets you, go into other stuff, but again, it's just another card or another garnet that you're adding to the deck that does not allow you to start playing, that synergizes with your engine. Yes, he's a dark, but he is not a level 3. He is not a Phantom Knight name, and nor does he allow you to basically send cards to the graveyard. Everything else in this deck either sends cards to the graveyard as a level 3 or is a free extension. Whereas this has to be the first thing that you do, which means that, of course, you're immediately putting an extra body on the board playing into Nib. You're immediately putting a body on the board that doesn't do as much as you want it to. So again, having to commit to a card that, only works when you've already started or facilitated playing, when you start using your right engine, is not that great. But yeah, Water and Griffin Rider obviously is a staple in here. Draco back for some reason is missing or hiding, so I'm not sure where that went, but Faithful Adventure, and then 2 right. We definitely don't need 3. I think 2 right is perfectly fine. I'm always sending Water Enchantress off of Cherubini. I mean, ideally, it's very rare that I don't. Unless I absolutely do not see a second name, I will always send Water Enchantress off Cherubini. It's just, there's just no reason not to. Like, having access to an Omni and having that type of advantage is actually very, very huge. So when I'm setting up my board, that's always a go-to. So having 3 is great because if you don't have to send it, sure, you open it and you play it. But being able to draw multiple rights is unnecessary. You can also pick up right out of the graveyard with Water Enchantress, so you're never technically running out until you're out of names. 2 is fine. Definitely don't need to play 3. As far as the adventure engine, I think that's the best way to play that. Again, no Illegal Knight, 2 right, 3 Water Enchantress. Do not cut this card. It's the best and only necessary extender that you do need in the deck. And that's the next thing I'm going to get into is these extenders. So when we're looking at the Burning Abyss engine, do not play the Burning Abyss engine. I think it's a great engine if you're playing Tour Guide, if you're playing a non-adventure engine that plays like Access Code and Nightmare Unicorn and other stuff. But in this type of deck with the Horus engine and the adventure package, it does absolutely nothing. Because ideally, if you look at it, you summon 2 level 3s, you send Graf for Sir, and then you go into Bardiche. Now you have a floating Cherubini that does nothing for you. You're not using it to go into Appaloosa. You're not link climbing any higher. If you have a floating name, like what floating name are you ideally using? Because for those who obviously know the deck and how, the deck sets up, it's very rare that you have an additional extended name that's either a Phantom Knight or a Horus monster. I mean, of course, that can happen with Mseti if you're going from, Graf to Sir to Cherubini. Then sure, you have these 2, but then what are we going into at that point? You can't go into IP because this is a link monster. And you can do SP, but then you're losing the value of the first effect. So again, it's just unnecessary. And even then, if you wanted to go into Appaloosa, you're still missing an additional body. So now you're having to go into Leviair to summon. Like, it's just unnecessary. Also, these are horrible cards to draw in this deck. They don't do anything for you. Most of the time, again, by the time you get to Cherubini, you're stuck having these names in hand and you can't pitch them early. So it's like, you have to get into Cherubini first, then start using your Mseti and King Sark to pitch and to get value. And at that point, you're then having to go, you're tunneling. Like, you're having to go into a line that may not be necessary when when setting up your board or playing into a board. So these cards just don't work right now. Again, if you're not playing Horus and you're playing like a regular level 3 extender deck, sure. But again, this is not a standard level 3 deck, and it's one thing that people need to really consider. If you're playing this, you're not playing this as a just, go into Cherubini, level 3s, level 3s. Yes, that is the premise for how we are setting up our combo. When you have different options like this, you don't want to tunnel on just focusing on having level 3s, because these cards, since they're not sharing the same name as the Phantom Knights, they don't do anything. They don't facilitate you being able to gain advantage and actually, be able to do something with them. Again, going into Cherubini is cool, being able to bring it back. But again, if you don't have the space in your extra deck to be playing cards like Appaloosa, I mean, you're having to just, expend resources for no reason. But I will say the dangers I do like. If you find room and you decide that you don't want to play as many board breaker or hand traps, you can most definitely play the dangers. I do like them. They're darks, they're level 3s. they do draw, and I think that's probably the most important thing, is that they are facilitating a draw in most situations. So you're going to be able to obviously reveal, discard, draw. You could draw into an Mseti, you could draw into Water Enchantress, right? I mean, there's obviously some valuable cards you can potentially draw into. They do, help you out a lot. It also, can get its effect off of Torrent Scale, which is really nice. So I would really say that if you are going to play at least one, it's always going to be the Tsukinoko. I mean, he resolves on his own. If he's discarded, he specials. I've never really been a fan of Jackalope because for some reason, every time I play Dangers, I always open up both, and then you can never resolve Jackalope. So it's like, it feels really bad when you hit him, and obviously, you don't have none in deck, but Tsukinoko is definitely, in my opinion, the best one to play. If you want to consider playing any level 3 extenders, it is most definitely the danger stuff. The psychic stuff, do not play either. Again, sure, they're level 3s. Yes, they're free summons, but you have to start off with a level 3. And in most situations, you're not always going to start off with a level 3. Because if you have Mseti and you have one of these, let's say, for example, you make Vampire and you don't hit a level 3, you're stuck with this card and it does nothing for you. It's not dark, it's a level 3, but again, without another level 3, you're not even going into Cherubini. Also, the issue with it as well is that it doesn't do anything for you once you've gotten into Cherubini. It's not a name. It's not Water Enchantress. It's not dark. Things like this are things that you really have to consider when you're establishing your board, because the most broken thing about this combo is that when you're going into the zombie vampire, you're doing it with these two, and then you have a dark, and all you have to do is literally just hit another dark off of zombie vampire. I mean, 4 cards off the top of yours, 4 cards off the top of your opponents. If you hit one dark, that's immediately Bardiche. You don't even have to touch Cherubini. And I think that's important to note, because then at that point, you've used whatever resources you needed to go into Bardiche, and then you're able to obviously continue from there. But if you have the option to go into Cherubini, then obviously you want to, because we want access to our adventure line. So that's one thing to consider. I would definitely not play, Italy. I wouldn't play these extenders. I don't think they're great. Getting into the sideboard, I don't like Thrust in the main board. As you can see, there are not very many good normal spells outside of Right, which is already searchable. Foolish, obviously, is a good one, but again, you don't really need to search it because your deck is just, based around sending stuff to grave anyways. So if you ever have to thrust for a Foolish, I think that's absolutely weird. Same thing with Rhoda. I mean, you would never thrust into a Rhoda because, I mean, you have your names here. So, in the main board, I definitely don't think thrust is necessary. You can side it. This deck does side very good, obviously, normal spells and traps like these here. D-Barrier is a very common one that people do like. I personally like things like Anti-Spell and Summon Limit, but again, if you want to focus more on a thrust package for the side, keep it in the side. Do not put it in the main board, because it does not provide you with any assistance. I mean, the most you can do is thrust talents, and even then, other cards are still better, outside of talents like Enemy Controller, Book of Moon. You get value on those cards pretty heavily playing this deck. So thrust in the side, perfectly fine for good cards like these. Droll. So I definitely want to get on the topic of Droll. This deck does have the potential to be able to play around Droll because of the engines and how they work. So ideally, a lot of times what I normally tend to do is, if I have the water package, I will go for Mseti first before I go for Water Enchantress, because as I explained before, you are able to get into Bardiche without even having to search. So you ideally are using Mseti to set up King Sark. You go into your, zombie vampire under Droll. You summon a guy. You've got 3 darks, and now you're able to pretty much go right into Bardiche. We're at least getting a Fog Blade and a name and grave, and then you're set up from there to at least be able to have some type of recursion. You're not going to get completely blown out. Plus whatever you have on board as well. So again, the deck can ideally get into Bardiche without even having to worry about Droll in most situations. But just like any other deck, Droll does obviously hurt this. I mean, Droll hurts just pretty much every deck in the game, depending on the type of hands that you open. But, it's more than doable, definitely playable. I mean, I normally, again, if I see 2 level 3s and an Mseti, I'm usually probably going to go for this first for the Water Enchantress, because you're at least going to be guaranteed, what you need to. So Droll is definitely, you can definitely play around Droll. There are ways to play through it. So another thing here, Harbinger, don't play Harbinger. I understand that number 90 is very expensive until it gets reprinted, but Harbinger is not that great, especially as a card to end on. Number 90 is definitely the strongest card because of Nibiru. This deck can play around Nibiru pretty well. You have access to an Omni, you have access to monster effect negation. Utilize it. Spell negation is actually not that great, just because most of the time spells that are being played right now are pretty much blowout spells. So if you play a spell and you have to negate it and your opponent has talents, you're probably going to get ran over. Like, whereas, having access to number 90 at least allows you to be able to stop a monster effect, and it actually does not negate activation, which is really nice. So obviously, if your opponent has a monster that can be used more than once, then, you're obviously not negating activation. You're just negating the effect. So it'll stop it. But it doesn't destroy, which is also somewhat nice in certain situations, because sometimes decks like Unchained, you negate something and you're not destroying it, so they're not going to be able to trigger abilities. So it comes up, and I definitely think that it's probably the most valuable card in the extra deck next to the Zombie Vampire that you want to play as a level 8. No Harbinger, and then obviously like the rest of the extra deck is pretty staple. I did want to touch on the links. So I definitely see a lot of people trying to play things like Nightmare Unicorn, Axis Code. I think those are fine. The spots here would usually be like Raiders Knight and Arc Rebellion, because I think that's actually the best line to go with, especially when you're playing this deck, because 90% of the time you're going to droplet, you're going to board break, you're going to droll, nib, and that just gives you access to being able to just OTK your opponent very easily. Because again, a lot of the hand traps I play, I don't like playing low impact hand traps. I know Ash is very strong, and in some situations, if your opponent's hand's bad, sure, Ash can stop them. But again, you're at that point, you're hoping that your opponent just can't continue playing. And I'm not a fan of that. I'd much rather droll my opponent so that they can only make a subpar board, and then all I have to do is play into it. Same thing with Nib. Nib doesn't necessarily shut down most decks, but you are able to pretty much activate Nib, stop your opponent's board, let them keep playing. Sure, they've now made a subpar board compared to their, obviously full combo, and then you play into their board and you kill them. So I like cards like that. Same thing with Droplet. Droplet just negates what it needs to, send stuff to grave, activate from grave, and you start playing. Cards like this are fine. I think Arc Rebellion is the better option, but these are the most important links. Definitely do not play these, because, Dark Charmer comes up. As I said, with the, whole idea of Zombie Vampire and Imseti, there are times where you can actually just pretty much like take your opponent's monster, make Gloomy if they have a dark monster, and then you can keep the extra body, and then you're able to go right into Bardiche. So there are situations, or if you don't even have the access to the extra body, let's say you only had the 2 cards and you had to use your Imseti for Zombie Vampire, that's another play as well. Your opponent mills a dark, sure, take whatever monster, go into Gloomy, take their dark, go into Bardiche. So it's very important to play cards like this. Even going second, this is a great card because it obviously is a way of being able to make Little Knight. And then, of course, Cherubini is important. IP is important. Bardiche is important. We all know why, obviously, for our end board and setting up our boards. These are the best ones that we should be playing as Link monsters. I definitely don't think Access Code and Unicorn are very necessary. The deck is very strong, especially going second. When you have access to Imseti, I think it's very important that you never side out any of these cards. And that's another thing. Do not side out any of your right package. Do not side out any of your Horus stuff. The only cards that should be coming out are non-engine cards or cards that you can facilitate seeing less of. So for example, if I'm going second, I'm not going to keep in 4 Phantom Knight names. Like, that's unnecessary. Like, I'm playing into a board. I don't want to draw any Fog Blade at all, for that matter. Unless I open up Droplet, then of course it's nice because you're able to play around your opponent's ability to respond with a trap. But ideally, you side one out, just have the 3 and then, take out Foolish, take out Rhoda, and that immediately gives you 3 slots for any of a 3 of in your sideboard. And then you're basically siding out, if you play Droll, you're siding out Droll if it's not a good card in the matchup. You're siding out Nib if it's not a good card in the matchup. Let's say your opponent's going to side Shifter. Don't keep in, Droplet. Maybe you put in, 3 evenly. Again, you just got to basically know the matchups and know what your opponent's going to be playing in their deck. And then decide from there what you think is obviously the best option for being able to side out certain cards. But I certainly recommend do not side out any of the Horus stuff. Do not side out any of the adventure stuff. These cards are amazing going second. 90% of the time when I go second, I usually never lose because, again, you have access to so many things. And the right package is actually very, very good against Rescuers because it's a non-effect monster. So the minute you summon the token, your opponent can't even respond to it. They can't book a Moon It with their dude. They can't, activate any of the traps on it. The only thing they can do is SP Knight, and that's it. So you put them in a position where if you're able to answer the SP Knight right away, the right pretty much is able to deal with everything else, like with Draco back and, again, being able to be a body on the board for you to start climbing into something. So, again, this is really strong. And then King Sark, I mean, you summon these 3 just inherently and you just push. Like, they just, they're big. He becomes 36. He gets you free cards. King Sark sends stuff. Imseti's 3,000. Like, it's really hard to face 3 dudes that never activated to summon themselves. I mean, they're custom cards. But going second, definitely don't side out any of your Horus stuff. Don't side out any of your right stuff. I never side any of it out at all in general. So I never touch any of this stuff. Same thing with the names. I never touch any of the names. The only thing I will touch is these. Hope that I covered most of everything to discuss in regards to the deck. Again, in one of my other videos, I have a small combo video that pretty much shows you how to utilize and set up the Horus engine as well as the Adventure engine with the Phantom Knights. So you can check that out there. But this is mainly just a discussion video to kind of go over some do's and don'ts of what I think are the best options when playing the deck, and of course, deck building. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Definitely let me know, your guys' take and your formula on Phantom Knights at the moment. I do think that this is the best way to play it. If you're not playing Adventure, if you're not playing Horus, I definitely don't think that you're going to be able to compete at a higher level, unfortunately, because there's just so much value here that Phantom Knights can take advantage of. So definitely make sure you're doing your due diligence on taking advantage of. Hope you guys enjoy the video. Definitely like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys later.